General Cassius stood before the emperor, his armor stained with the blood of Rome's enemies, expecting a laurel wreath for his victory. Instead, he was handed a sword and pointed toward a woman kneeling in the dust, a woman whose death would tear his own heart out. "Hey friends, welcome. I'm Marcus. Another incredible gladiator story for you today. This isn't just a story about blood and sand, it's about the cost of a human soul. Let me know where you're watching from and please hit that subscribe button. Let's get started." And who Cassius was to understand the magnitude of this moment. They called him the Eagle of the North. For 15 years, he had expanded the borders of the empire. He was the man who slept in the mud with his soldiers, the man who ate the same dry bread, the man who never asked a legionary to do something he wouldn't do himself. To the people of Rome, he was a hero. To the Emperor Domitian, he was a threat. Domitian was a small, jealous man who sat on a gold throne while better men bled for him. He saw the way the crowds cheered for Cassius. He saw the love in the soldiers' eyes. And he hated it. He decided that today, amidst the triumph, he would break his best general in front of the entire city. The victory parade had ended in the center of the Colosseum. Flowers rained down. Trumpets blared. Cassius stood tall, his helmet tucked under his arm. He waited for the emperor's speech. But Domitian didn't give a speech. He simply clapped his hands. The large iron gates at the far end of the arena creaked open. 2 Praetorian guards dragged a prisoner out into the sunlight. The prisoner was a woman. She was dressed in the torn rags of a barbarian, her hair matted, her wrists bound in heavy iron chains. But when she lifted her head, Cassius felt the world stop turning. It was Eleni, flashback to 3 years ago. The forests of Germania. Cassius had been separated from his unit, wounded, bleeding out in the snow. It wasn't a Roman medic who found him. It was a local healer. Eleni. She could have slit his throat. She could have left him to the wolves. Instead, she dragged him to a cave. She stitched his wounds. She fed him broth made from roots. For 2 weeks, they spoke in broken whispers. He was the conqueror, and she was the conquered, but in that cave, they were just 2 souls trying to survive the winter. When his legion found him, he let her go. He watched her run back into the trees, promising himself he would never let harm come to her, and now, here she was. On her knees in the sand, "General," Domitian's voice cut through the silence like a whip. "We captured a spy. A rebel who has been poisoning the minds of the northern tribes. We believe she nursed a Roman officer back to health once, only to steal his secrets." The emperor smiled. A cold, reptilian smile. He knew. He knew everything. This wasn't justice. This was a test. "Prove your loyalty, Cassius," Domitian commanded, leaning over the edge of his box. "Execute the traitor. Show Rome that duty comes before sentiment." The crowd went quiet. They sensed the tension. They saw the way Cassius's hand trembled as he reached for the executioner's sword. This was the Eagle of the North. He had killed 1,000 men. Why was he hesitating over one girl? Cassius walked toward her. His boots felt like lead. Eleni looked up. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She looked at him with the same fierce, gentle eyes that had watched over him in the dark. "Do it," she mouthed. "Do it, and live." She was ready to die to save him. Again, Cassius gripped the sword. The leather hilt creaked. He looked at the emperor, who was sipping wine, enjoying the show. He looked at his soldiers, who were watching their commander with confusion. Then he looked at Eleni. If he killed her, he kept his rank, his honor, and his life. If he refused, he was a traitor. You have to imagine the heat of the sun on his neck. The smell of the dust. The sound of his own heart hammering against his ribs like a war drum. Cassius raised the heavy sword. The sun glinted off the sharp steel. He took a breath. He tightened his muscles. Domitian leaned forward, his eyes wide with anticipation. Cassius swung, but he didn't swing down. With a roar that shook the arena walls, Cassius spun around. He didn't strike the girl. He threw the sword. It flew through the air, end over end, a spinning wheel of death, and slammed into the wood of the Emperor's box, just inches from Domitian's face. The wood splintered. The Emperor fell back, spilling his wine. The crowd gasped, a collective sound of shock that sucked the air out of Rome. Cassius stood empty-handed. He turned his back on the Emperor. He walked to Eleni, grabbed the chains binding her wrists, and with a strength born of pure rage, he pulled until the link snapped. He helped her stand. Then he turned to face the Praetorian Guard, who were already drawing their weapons. He was one man against an empire. He had no sword. He had no shield. But as he stood there, shielding the woman he loved, he looked more dangerous than any army. The sword was still vibrating in the wood of the imperial box. A thin line of red wine dripped from Domitian's goblet onto his white toga, looking like a fresh wound. For a heartbeat, the entire Roman Empire held its breath. You have to understand the magnitude of this silence. It wasn't just shock, it was the sound of the world shifting on its axis. A general had just attempted to assassinate the emperor in full view of the Senate, the army, and the people. The penalty for this wasn't just death. It was damnatio memoriae, the erasure of one's entire existence from history. But Cassius didn't look like a man who cared about history books. He looked like a man who had finally found something worth dying for. He stood alone in the center of the vast arena, his chest heaving, his hands empty, protecting the woman who was shivering behind him. Kill him. Domitian screamed, his voice cracking with fear and rage. He pointed a shaking finger at the man who had won him half a continent. Cut him down. Flay him alive. I want his head on a spike before the sun sets. The spell broke. The heavy iron gates of the Praetorian Guard opened with a groan. 12 elite soldiers marched out. These weren't your average legionaries. These were the Emperor's personal killers, men clad in black lacquered armor, their faces hidden behind masks of impassive steel. They moved in perfect synchronization, a 12-headed hydra of shields and spears closing in on one unarmed man. The crowd began to murmur. They loved Cassius, but they feared the Emperor more. They expected a slaughter. They expected Cassius to kneel and beg. But you don't become the eagle of the north by begging. Cassius looked at Eleni. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the glint of the approaching spears. Stay behind me, he whispered, his voice calm, steady, anchoring her in the storm. When I move, you move. Do not let go of my belt. You have no weapon, she hissed, terror tightening her throat. I am the weapon, Cassius replied. The first Praetorian lunged. It was a textbook thrust, fast and aimed at the heart. But Cassius had trained these men. He knew the rhythm of their violence before they even twitched a muscle. He didn't retreat. He stepped into the strike. You have to picture the speed of it. Cassius caught the shaft of the spear just below the blade, twisted his hips, and used the guard's own momentum to throw him. The soldier flew over Cassius's shoulder, crashing into the sand with a sound like a sack of coins dropping. Before the man could recover, Cassius stomped on his wrist, shattering the bone, and kicked the shield into the face of the second attacker. It was a dance of brutality. Cassius moved like water flowing around rocks. He dodged a sword by an inch, the wind of the blade cooling the sweat on his neck. He headbutted the helmeted soldier, not caring about the blood that burst from his own forehead. He was fighting with the desperation of a cornered wolf. He grabbed a fallen sword from the sand, a heavy, rusted thing left over from a previous fight, and suddenly, the odds shifted. Now, the eagle had his talons, but there were too many of them. A spear tip grazed his ribs, tearing through his tunic and opening a gash that began to weep crimson. Another blow caught him on the shoulder, numbing his left arm. He stumbled. The circle tightened. Eleni screamed as a guard grabbed her hair, trying to drag her away. No. Cassius roared. He spun, ignoring the swords at his back, and severed the guard's hand with a single, savage swing. He pulled Eleni back to him, his breathing ragged. Blood dripping into his eyes. They were surrounded. 12 had become 8, but Cassius was tiring. You know that feeling when your muscles burn so hot they feel like they are dissolving? When your lungs are screaming for air that isn't there? That was Cassius. He was 40 years old. He had old wounds that ached in the rain. He couldn't keep this up forever. Up in the stands, a different kind of battle was brewing. The 10th Legion, Cassius's own men, 5,000 strong, were watching. These were men who had marched with him through the frozen forests of Germania. They had eaten his bread. They had followed him into hell and back. And now, they were being forced to watch their father figure be butchered like a criminal by men who had never seen a real war. Domitian saw the hesitation in the crowd. He saw that Cassius wasn't dying fast enough. "Archers," he shrieked, frothing at the mouth. "Loose! Kill them both! Turn them into pincushions." A line of archers on the arena wall knocked their arrows. They drew the strings back to their ears. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. 50 arrows pointed at Cassius and Eleni. There was no dodging this. No amount of skill could stop a rain of death. Cassius dropped his sword. He didn't surrender. He simply realized that steel wouldn't save him now. He grabbed Eleni and pulled her into his chest, wrapping his massive arms around her, burying her face in his neck. He turned his back to the archers, using his own body as a human shield to protect her from the volley. He closed his eyes. He waited for the bite of the iron. "Loose!" Domitian screamed. Twang! The sound of bowstrings release echoed. But no arrows flew. Cassius waited. 1 second. 2 seconds. He felt no pain. He opened his eyes. He turned slowly. The archers had fired. But they hadn't fired at him. 50 arrows were sticking out of the sand in a perfect circle around Cassius and Eleni, forming a protective ring. Not a single one had touched them. Domitian froze. His face went pale, draining of color until he looked like a corpse. He looked at the captain of the archers. The captain lowered his bow, looked directly at the emperor, and spat on the ground. Then, a sound started in the lower stands. A rhythmic thumping. Thump. 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 It was the sound of a pilum hitting a shield. One soldier from the 10th Legion was striking his shield. Then another. Then 10. Then 100. Then 5,000. The sound was deafening, a thunder that shook the foundations of the Colosseum. It was the sound of loyalty. It was the sound of mutiny. Cassius. 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 The chant started low, a rumble in the earth, and rose to a roar that drowned out the emperor's frantic screams. The Praetorian guards in the arena lowered their weapons. They looked at the enraged legionaries in the stands, then at the unarmed general who had just defeated 4 of their best. And they made a calculation. They sheathed their swords. They stepped back. Cassius looked up at his men. Tears mixed with the blood on his face. He raised a fist to them. The roar became so loud it felt like physical blows. Domitian fell back into his chair, trembling. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that a golden crown does not make you a king. Respect makes you a king. And he had none. If he ordered the death of Cassius now, the 10th Legion would storm the box, burn the palace, and hang him from the columns of the Senate. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he was powerless. Cassius didn't wait for permission. He put his arm around Eleni. "Walk," he whispered. "Don't look back. Just walk." They walked across the sand. The gate of life, usually reserved for the victors, stood open. The guards at the gate didn't stop them. They slammed their fists against their chests in a salute. Cassius walked out of the shadow of the Colosseum and into the blinding light of the Roman afternoon. He walked past the statue of Mars, past the vendors who had abandoned their stalls to watch the spectacle. He kept walking until the roar of the crowd faded into a distant hum. They didn't stop at his villa. They didn't stop to pack gold or clothes. They walked straight to the city gates, took 2 horses from a startled stable master who refused to take payment when he saw who it was, and rode north. You might think this is where the story ends. The hero rides into the sunset. But history is rarely that clean. Domitian raged for weeks. He put a price on Cassius's head that could buy a small kingdom. Bounty hunters, assassins, and spies scoured the empire for years. But the eagle of the north had vanished. Some said the gods had taken him. Some said he had gone back to Germania to raise an army of barbarians to destroy Rome, but the truth? The truth was much quieter. 10 years later, in a small valley in the Alps, where the air is thin and cold, a man was teaching a young boy how to hold a wooden sword. The man was older now, his hair the color of iron, his movements slower. He had a scar on his forehead that looked like a lightning bolt. A woman sat on the porch of a log cabin, watching them, her hands busy weaving wool. She wasn't a barbarian prisoner anymore. She was a wife. She was a mother. Father, the boy asked, lowering the wooden sword. Is it true you were the strongest man in Rome? Cassius looked at the boy. He looked at the mountains that shielded them from the world. He looked at Eleni, who smiled at him with the same fierce love that had saved him in a cave all those years ago. No, Cassius said softly, kneeling to look his son in the eye. I wasn't the strongest because I could fight. I was the strongest because I knew when to stop fighting. He took the wooden sword from the boy's hand and placed it gently on the grass. Strength isn't about killing, Leo. It's about protecting. The day I threw my sword away was the only day I truly won. Domitian was eventually assassinated by his own guards, the same men he had ordered to kill Cassius. Rome fell into chaos, emperors rose and fell like tides. But high in the mountains, the eagle slept peacefully. He had traded an empire for a family. He had traded glory for a life. And if you asked him, even with the cold wind biting his old wounds, he would tell you it was the best trade any man ever made. When Cassius finally died, many years later, they found no gold in his house. No medals. No trophies. Only a small, wooden carving of an eagle, and under it, scratched into the wood, were the words, Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. This brings us to the end of our story. Cassius proved that sometimes, the bravest thing a soldier can do is disobey an order. He showed us that loyalty to a title is nothing compared to loyalty to a human being. This is Marcus. Thank you for watching. I want to ask you a question that might be hard to answer. If you were in that arena, with the emperor commanding you and the world watching, would you have the courage to throw the sword? Or would you do your duty? Be honest in the comments. If this story moved you, please share it. Let the legend of the eagle spread. Subscribe for more stories of glory, betrayal, and redemption. Until next time, protect what you love.